was crystal clear that this man was a perpetrator of child sexual abuse. The church was aware of it, and he continued to have access to youth in the church.
Welcome back to Parallel Justice, the podcast that dives into the crimes and cases that have dominated the national headlines through exclusive interviews with the very attorneys who fought the cases. Some of the discussion you hear today may be controversial. However, we know that silence, especially on tough issues, only enables and encourages wrongdoers. It's our goal to bring these issues to light so that we may have meaningful discourse around them. The views expressed in this podcast are those of our guests, who are experts in these areas. Their opinions are invaluable, however, they do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Center for Victims of Crime. The topics we discuss may be disturbing, and they are intended for adult audiences only. Some of these topics may also be triggering, and we encourage you to practice good self-care and seek support. I'm Renee Williams, Executive Director of the National Center for Victims of Crime, and your guide through this conversation. Now, let's start the show. Welcome back to another episode of Parallel Justice. I am your host, Renee Williams. Today we have a repeat guest with us, Peter Janci out of Oregon from the law firm of Janci and Crew. Peter's here to talk with us today about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known usually as LDS or Mormons. And before we get into this discussion, I just want to acknowledge, as I always do before we talk about a specific church or religious beliefs, this is not meant as an attack on religion. Nothing Peter nor what I say is an attack of LDS fundamentally and truly held religious beliefs. What we are doing is an examination of individuals who have been using religion as a shield to commit abuses and hide behind religious beliefs to hide the fact that they are actually perpetrating crimes. So with that, I want to give Peter first a chance to just reintroduce himself to our Parallel Justice listeners.
Well, thanks, Renee. Good to be here with you. Again, I'm Peter Janci from Crew Janci Law Firm in Portland. Our firm is exclusively focused on representing victims of sexual violence, primarily victims of child sexual abuse. And most of our cases involve abuse that was enabled or allowed by the institutional setting. We have handled a lot of cases involving large religious organizations. And although most folks usually think of the Catholic Church as, when we say that phrase, which we've handled a number of cases involving the Catholic Church, but we've also handled a lot of cases involving the Mormon Church and Seventh-day Adventist Church and other religious organizations. So pleasure to be here with you today.
Now, let's just set the table because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the Mormon Church. And like many religions, there are several branches that are offshoots of this church, and each has its own different belief. Can you give us kind of an overarching view of the LDS Church and their beliefs?
Sure. With the caveat that I'm not a member, I've never been a member of the Mormon Church. And so my knowledge and understanding is based on what I've learned from working on cases on behalf of victims. I think when we use the term Mormonism, we're talking about a larger movement that has several different churches under that umbrella. The most commonly and the most prolific and largest Mormon church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is headquartered in Salt Lake City, Utah. But for many, under the banner of the term Mormonism or the Mormon movement, there are also several other churches, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and some other similar offshoots that have smaller followings and in some ways probably what would widely be seen as maybe more extreme beliefs or adherence to practices that have been abandoned or disregarded by the primary, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah.
And I think it's important to point out that most of the really news-making abuses, the Warren Jeffs of the world, are members of the offshoots of FLDS that aren't necessarily recognized or embraced by the mainstream Mormon Church.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a lot of popular culture focus on Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and some of the other more the offshoots. The LDS Church, or the TCJC as it is asking to be called now, which is based in Salt Lake City, is distances itself from those offshoots. And I think there's popular interest in the offshoots because, of course, all these Mormon sects share a common history and a common origin story, and so I think there are questions in a lot of people's minds about how separate or different they are, and when it comes to some of the concerning phenomena, although they may be more prevalently discussed regarding the fundamentalist offshoots, I think there are questions about, well, what's going on with the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
So let's start to talk about that. You're representing victims in some of these cases. What happened here?
Well, the most recent case that we have been handling that garnered a fair amount of media attention is a case out of our home state of Oregon. And in that case, our client, who has decided to use his name, David Heiser, decided to file a lawsuit against the National Church out of Salt Lake City based on abuse that he suffered in Corvallis, Oregon, in the late 1970s and 1980s. And this case has garnered a lot of national attention when we filed it because essentially, I think for a couple reasons. One is Mr. Heiser is still, or at least at the time of filing, was still a devout member of the LDS Church, which is fairly unusual to have folks who are, active members in good standing bring lawsuits against the church. And I think what motivated Mr. Heiser was the egregious facts of what he learned about what had happened in his situation, which was, in a nutshell, that the perpetrator that abused him, who held positions of trust with youth in the church, had been reported, was known to have been a sexual abuser, in fact, was convicted of child sexual abuse crimes prior to the end of Mr. Heiser's abuse as a child. And we know that the church was aware of those crimes and of the conviction because the church actually got involved in the criminal case and lobbied the court for leniency for the perpetrator and helped the perpetrator get a lesser sentence, which of course gave him more access to youth in the community. So we can delve into the facts more, but at a high level, I think this case shows, a concerning occurrence of, direct notice. It was crystal clear that this man was a perpetrator of child sexual abuse. The church was aware of it, and he continued to have access to youth in the church despite that knowledge.
Now, what year was he criminally prosecuted?
He was criminally prosecuted, as I recall, and convicted in, I think, 1983.
And so then he was released. And is there evidence of how many more children he abused because the church lobbied for his release?
Well, in our investigation, we're aware that there were more children, several more children that were involved with the church that were abused. We think that there were many more beyond what we're aware of, and maybe we'll get to the topic of, why in the Mormon Church and similar faiths you have particularly low reporting levels. But we also know that this perpetrator, Ronald Curley, was a licensed professional counselor in Oregon, and he remained both a member in good standing in the church and a licensed professional counselor for several decades after this happened. And he was ultimately stripped by the state of his license as a professional counselor because of sexual misconduct with college-aged men during his counseling sessions. So, this is someone who was discovered to be a sexual predator in the early 1980s and was continued to have access to vulnerable people for decades thereafter. And the church, on paper, there's a documentary record of their lobbying to have a less severe sentence for him, and I think there's a reasonable question in people's minds about how much more access that gave him because he got a lighter sentence.
So I think this raises an interesting question because, and maybe it's just in our line of work, we tend to hear a little bit more than other people or pay closer attention to it. It seems like I've heard about abuse in the Mormon church for years, and that it's kind of a well-known secret, but that it's constantly kept secret. And we haven't seen the type of action against the Mormon church as we saw in the watershed moment with the Catholic cases or the Boy Scouts. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. One is the Mormon church and members of the LDS community. It's a very insular community. It is it's a community where members' whole lives, their social structures, everything is built around their membership in the church, and to a greater degree than I would say even the Catholic Church or some other religious entities that we've seen. So for a victim to come forward, they are putting at risk, their entire identity, their entire community, their entire support structure. So it takes tremendous courage. They're also taught from a very young age, values about respecting authority and deferring to the church as, God's inspired body on earth. And so, I think that dynamic is present also in the Catholic Church and some other similar situations. But so for one, it takes a lot of courage, and there's a lot of risk for victims to come forward. I think in addition to that, something historically that has been a challenge is if you were to take a map of where the largest Mormon communities are centered, and you compared that to some sort of gradation of civil statute of limitations, there are a lot of places where Mormonism is prolific, where the law does not allow or has not, historically allowed victims much opportunity to come forward. So, Utah, Idaho, a number of other Western states where civil statute of limitations reform has not yet been, manifest in a real significant way or at all, means that even for those folks that muster the courage to try to come forward, if they reach out to an advocate, it's likely that they're, given what we know about how long it takes for victims to come forward, it's likely that by the time they do that, because of where their abuse happened, the courthouse doors may be shut to them.
Now, how pervasive do you think abuse is within the Mormon church?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Or let me interrupt it and change that even slightly. Mm-hmm. Does it matter from branch to branch? Where do we stand there?
Well, admittedly, most of our litigation has involved the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City. We have not undertaken litigation against the FLDS or other offshoots. So I'd have to speak largely from my experience with the LDS in Salt Lake. I guess here's what we know. There was sort of a moment in history in the early 2000s where a group of faithful Mormon scholars and thought leaders who were interested in reform formed a group called the Mormon Alliance that did an in-depth look at a few core social issues that they believe needed reform in the Mormon Church. And they released several volumes called the Case Reports of the Mormon Alliance. And one of I think it's 3 or 4 volumes, one entire volume is focused on sexual abuse and sexual violence in the Mormon Church. So I think that was a snapshot in history. And Unfortunately, the church did not respond well to the work of the Mormon Alliance, and a lot of those people were driven out of the church, and are sort of post Mormon at this point. But so I think that historically there's been a very significant child sexual abuse problem in the LDS Church, and we can maybe talk about the reasons for that. But yeah, I think it has the hallmarks of the types of organizations and cultures where we see child sexual abuse happening, not being responded to as well as it should have been, and therefore predators being allowed to be prolific. And so I think if you couple that with a relatively low level of litigation and relatively low exposure of the problem, I think it's likely that it has lasted much longer. And the secrecy around this problem in the church and the extent of it, and the church's intentional efforts to try to keep it quiet, it shrouds that data a bit and makes it difficult for us to pinpoint. But just based on the context that we get and the information we have and the information that's available out there, I think it's been a significant problem, and it has been underreported and has not been, I think there are a lot of victims out there who have not received any sort of justice.
Now, we've talked quite a bit about, again, the Catholic Church, Boy Scouts. You and I talked about Indian Health Services, and in each of these cases, we kind of see a massive cover-up and a playbook almost that gets distributed across the board. Did they have a playbook here? Was that what was going on in all of these cases?
Well, I think there were a couple things that were, historically common phenomena when it came to abuse in the Mormon Church. First of all, you have a lay leadership structure in the Mormon Church that is somewhat different than most churches. The Mormon Church does not generally, at least at the local level, which the geography in any particular locality is broken up by wards or branches, which is sort of the parish level if you're thinking about the Catholic Church comparison, and stakes, which are a sort of a hub of multiple wards or branches. And at the local congregation level, at the ward or the branch, the leadership of that local church is not a professional ordained leader. It is a rotating lay leadership. So a male of religious standing in the congregation is called every so often, called being a term of religious significance, a calling from God, but basically appointed and selected to serve as the bishop of that local congregation. And they serve a certain term, but they hold another job, another occupation, maybe a dentist or a mechanic or whatever else. And so I think historically the church has had leadership at the local level that does not have sort of uniform training and education in the same way that churches where there are professional clergy may have. I think also when it comes to sort of the common phenomena, you just have the insular community that is interested in protecting its identity and protecting its reputation. And this is a uniquely American religion that is focused on growth and expansion. And so when you couple that together with a focus on family values, I think you see a dynamic where there's a lot of emphasis put on portraying a certain image to draw people into the faith. And that, of course, is at odds with the public airing of concerns about misconduct. So there's a lot of pressure to keep things quiet, to deal with them internally. The church has, because of, I think, their concern for their reputation and their desire to be viewed in certain ways, has in some instances been more proactive in reaching out to known victims to quietly settle cases directly with victims before they can get a lawyer or file a lawsuit, or maybe get information about the full extent of what happened or understand the strength of their legal claims. And so, there's a number of these types of phenomena that have allowed the LDS Church to keep its abuse problem relatively under wraps.
Legal question that might seem basic about some of those settlements. So, I mean, in Scientology, we saw where a California court kicked out their agreements that people could not sue. Participants in Scientology, once they left, could not sue. And the court kicked that out and said it was completely unjust. Are these settlements that the church reaches with victims upheld? Are they legally binding?
I'm not aware of any challenges where a victim who entered into directly entered into a settlement agreement with the church challenged it and was able to get a court to overturn it on some sort of theory that it was exploitative. So I guess perhaps partially to their credit, the church has not relied on sort of preemptive waivers of the right to seek justice. Instead, they've been somewhat savvy, and there are instances where they have learned that someone is a victim historically, and there are stories about representatives for the church flying and going to that person's house with a check and saying, "Gosh, we're sorry. Here's what we would probably most of us view as a nominal amount compared to what the case is probably worth," but kind of relying on their faithfulness and their membership in the community, and extending somewhat of an olive branch and resolving those cases directly with victims.
How did they identify those victims? Were there records? Did they have a suspicion, or did the victims come forward?
I can think of a number of situations that I've been made aware of, and it's kind of been a mix. Sometimes, victims who are still devout are encouraged to share with their current bishops if they have things that they're upset about or struggling with. And what's interesting about the Mormon Church in some ways is, although there's kind of lay leadership and it's somewhat congregational at the local level, it's also from there basically a straight line to the headquarters in Salt Lake City. So if a bishop at the Portland, Oregon ward receives information, they're supposed to call headquarters, and headquarters in Salt Lake City will make the decision about what to do, or may guide or advise the bishop about how to handle that. So I know there have been situations where a member has directly reported to a bishop, and that's been reported up the chain and triggered a response from the church. There have been other situations, I believe, where the church has just become aware through maybe existing litigation of the names of other people who were impacted, and have been proactive in reaching out to those folks.
So that brings up a multifaceted question, I think. I'm trying to think of how to phrase it. So like you said, we usually want to see, and victims want to see, policies that actually change. So has the church started to do any of that in being proactive, or are they just knocking on doors, writing checks?
No, I mean, I think the church, I think we should give credit where credit is due. And I think the church has undertaken to enact, additional youth protection policies, and to try to make sure that kids today are safer than kids in the LDS church were in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But I think there's a lot of work to be done. And, I think there's from my perspective and my dealings, I think there's a bit of a culture of arrogance when it comes to the leadership's view of their current policies and practices. And, they have publicly stated that they have the gold standard of youth protection. And, I have questions about that. I mean, I'm currently involved with a matter that involves a report to a Mormon bishop that happened in the last 5 or 6 years, and the bishop didn't take action, and that child continued to be abused by that perpetrator for a long period of time. And so I think there's a danger for any organization to rest on its laurels when it comes to child protection, and to say we have the gold standard. Even if you have improved things a lot, I think that policies are good, but what we really need to see is organizations move from policies to also embracing a culture of child protection. And that means at some level, ever vigilance and a constant willingness to review and reflect and think about and take action about where things can still be improved.
How do we get congregants, and given what you've said about kind of the closed nature of the LDS, how do you think that culture can be changed?
Well, I think that we have to educate. We have to educate people at a congregant level about what child sexual abuse is, about how to identify it, about the serious long-term implications. Because I think if people don't understand how prevalent it is, how it happens, and how serious it is, they don't have the tools to, or sort of the framework to know that and then we have to tell them what to do. And so I think there's an education level or an education effort that needs to happen, frankly, among most churches at the congregation level. In addition to sort of the policies and practices of, okay, now that you've seen something concerning, this is what you do. But there's also just cultural issues that are a challenge, I think, when it comes to reporting and proactive action. In my experience with a number of sort of insular religious groups, one of the things I've always been concerned about is in organizations where the voice of women is not valued in the same way as the voice of men, we're losing out on a huge opportunity to be watchful and to be responsive when there are concerning issues.
So this leads to an interesting question. With the Mormon Church going to write checks for folks, and with the Mormon Alliance reports that you mentioned, is the Mormon Church taking this to a criminal prosecutor, or are they allowing the individual perpetrators to stay in the community and continue to offend?
Well, that's a complicated answer, I think. I don't know that. I think part of the problem is I don't think that even if there are currently good intentions and good practices identified, I don't know that they're being uniformly applied. I think historically there are many examples of situations where in the 70s, 80s, 90s, where perpetrators were not reported to the police. In fact, I think there are a number of situations where that was people were dissuaded from doing that. It was supposed to be held or dealt with closely, quietly in the church through the church discipline process. And this raises I think an important question, which is still sort of on the frontier of litigation involving the LDS Church, because we know that the LDS Church, given the sort of hierarchical nature, the LDS Church has maintained records, annotations on membership files, also called sort of red flags. They've maintained documentation in many situations about knowledge that they had regarding perpetrators and what they knew and when they knew it. And that's a body of information that is still to be released. It's still sort of a battleground in the fight between victims seeking reform and the church.
So this takes me back to your particular case. that perpetrator was criminally prosecuted and
Right.
then was released. Where is he now?
He's still in the community. And, I can think of a number of cases I've handled involving the LDS Church with very prolific offenders who are in the community because they were not reported adequately, or the extent of the information that was known about the number of victims or abuse was not shared, and it was dealt with quietly and internally, and or victims were not encouraged to come forward, and so some of the most prolific LDS abusers that I have come across are in the community.
Are they still active in the church and welcomed into the church as well?
That would vary from person to person. There are some that have been excommunicated by the church or kicked out and are not welcome. But I can think of at least one or two that have restrictions placed on them and may not be sort of in full good standing, but are still members of the church and still still allowed to participate at some level, even though our lawsuit was expressly not about abuse that happened in relation to the church-sponsored scout troop. They were able to get our case stayed, so we're stuck waiting for the bankruptcy court to make its decision in the Boy Scout bankruptcy, because some of the abuse that our client suffered occurred in the context of the LDS church-sponsored scout troop. And even though that's not what we sued in our lawsuit, again, that's not what we sued the LDS church for. We sued them for the abuse that happened in relation to other LDS youth activities. They were still able to get themselves get the case stayed through the bankruptcy.
Are you kidding?
No.
But the bankruptcy has absolutely nothing to do with whether they're held liable. The
church's position historically in the bankruptcy has been that they should be released for claims by any individual who was abused, who had any abuse that happened in relation to scouting, even if they have had a bunch of abuse that happened unrelated to scouting and other LDS activities. They took the position early on, and I don't think, to my knowledge, they haven't backed away from that they believe they should be released from the entirety of those claims. The court hasn't ruled on that issue, but that was at least, and maybe they varied their position closer to the confirmation hearings, but and I'm just forgetting that, but certainly for a large part of the case, their position was they should make their contribution to the bankruptcy, and that should wipe out the claims of anybody who had any abuse that had any connection to the scout troop.
I want to go back to the Mormon Alliance because that seems like a positive step for the Mormon Church that we wish other religions would take often, or other sects of a religion would take, which is to look at themselves unprompted by litigation, but because they want the church to be better. And so they do this. What happened to those reports? Were they just shoved to the side? Did the Mormon Alliance make any steps to publicize them or to push them out or to send those to the police?
Well, the Mormon Alliance published their reports and tried to make them, I think, as widely available as they could. But it was a grassroots effort by individuals who were reform-minded. It was not officially, sanctioned by the church, and at least my understanding, it was not welcomed by the church, and that a lot of the folks that participated and had leadership roles in the Mormon Alliance were, ostracized, marginalized, or completely sort of pushed out of the church. So, I can't speak to what the LDS Church officially did with regards to the reports and recommendations of the Mormon Alliance, and whether they did any, whether they looked at them or made, adopted any of the recommendations. But my understanding as as someone who's looked into it and researched a bit and read some of the reports is that they were not welcomed. And so it's on the one hand, I think it's an admirable and commendable undertaking that the Mormon Alliance did, but I think it's similar to what we see in other faiths where maybe like what's going on with the Southern Baptist Convention and others, where the core leadership of the headquarters is sort of dragged kicking and screaming by a motivated smaller faction of people that have just had enough and said, hey, this is not okay. We have got to do something about this. And it reaches a boiling point where they can't ignore it. But I think it would be, at least from my understanding, it would be inaccurate to think of the work of the Mormon Alliance as sort of the result of initiative taken at the church headquarters level.
So we're talking about what is the watershed moment going to be? And we're at the very beginning of litigation for the LDS Church. Why do you think there's such a tight hold on this church? How have they managed to stay so below the radar and out of kind of the spotlight on this?
Well, I think that the LDS Church is notable, maybe in a quiet way, but for its for the reaches of its influence and frankly its wealth and power. I think first of all, we don't know the full extent of the wealth of the LDS Church, but we know from a number of different sources that it's enormous. And with wealth comes power. It's also an organization that has been very intentional about encouraging members to get into positions of authority in government, in public service, and to carefully craft the image of the church as wholesome and respectable, etc. And of course there are many devout Mormons who are those things, and certainly don't cast any aspersions on those folks at all. But I think it's a very wealthy, very powerful organization. It's very hierarchical, and that power and wealth is wielded and held by a very small group of people at the end of the day. And so I don't know that we'll ever know all the machinations behind the scenes that allow them to maintain their image and control some of the narrative in the ways that they do, but they are active, they are intentional in it. And it's one of the major issues in some of the litigation with the church, in places where we can seek punitive damages for the egregious conduct of the church. Claims for punitive damages open up the church to discovery on its finances. And the church has opposed that with great vigor, and I believe will continue to do so. So, I think the significance for victims is, these cases are an uphill battle against a large, powerful organization. It's a very unique culture and a unique set of belief systems and a unique organization that requires some expertise to sort of figure out, where things happened and how they happened. But maybe the silver lining in all that is this is an organization that has the resources to compensate victims. And so if and when they come to a place, whether on an individual case basis or more holistically, where they are ready to do that, they're certainly capable of it. And I think that's the hope for a lot of victims who do come forward, is that, real reform will happen, and that the LDS Church will make amends for what's happened in its history, and embrace changes and a culture of protection.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. If you have any questions about your rights after listening to this show, please visit us at victimsofcrime.org. Our guest's information is also always available in the show notes. This podcast was created by the National Center for Victims of Crime in partnership with our center and affiliate, the National Crime Victim Bar Association. More information about both organizations is available at victimsofcrime.org and victimbar.org. Thank you, and please join us again next week.